Could you imagine being so good at annoying somebody that they decided to change the course of aviation history 50 years ago by inventing magic? Oh wait. Today we're going to talk about America's first true stealth aircraft to enter mass-produced service, the F-117 Nighthawk, aka the Cockroach, the Stink Bug, and the Wobblin' Goblin. This aircraft is easily one of the most recognizable planes in Uncle Sam's inventory, mostly because it's the only one designed to look like a flying geometry lesson. And much like an average math lesson, it is custom built to be so complicated that most earthly things cannot process what they're looking at, including radars. This is the first mass-produced platform designed to have a low observable radar cross-section, which most people today just call stealth. And yet it is still up and kicking today, with some reasonable speculation being present that it was brought back from retirement, not only to teach America's pilots to fight sneaky targets, but also to teach the enemy to write their wills before leaving home. No plane out there better represents the evolution of stealth over the years, because its primary job now is to be found by Allied aircraft, but before, it was only supposed to hide from enemy missiles. After the Vietnam and Yom Kippur Wars, the Soviets had been taking notes on the amount of can-tanning caused by their surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, and the short version of it was a lot. Even America's top-of-the-line Phantoms were getting their teeth kicked in by the rocket-propelled telephone poles as part of the newest air defense concept, the Integrated Air Defense System. So the Soviets looked at their SAMs, then looked at their home defense protocols and said, "More, please," and began work on their own top-notch air defense network. They began investing heavily into more powerful search radars and more mobile SAM sites. They wanted the search radars to pick up on flying objects from much farther away, and the mobile SAM batteries to reposition easily, making it harder to find them. This also offered the benefit of being able to push up with a rolling invasion force, and some of these SAMs were theoretically capable of carrying nuclear warheads. As was the case for the Cold War, the US wanted to know how this would play out for a full-scale European conflict, and according to their calculations, the entire US Air Force would be shot down in 2.5 weeks, which naturally made the US hit the panic button yet again, F-15 Edition Part 2 Electric Boogaloo, and decide it was time for a rematch with the laws of nature. Because the Soviets had basically turned their missile sites into the Mystery Machine, except the gang's about to split up and look for you. And Uncle Sam just got through playing an entire war game of Whack-A-Missile as player one, and they had more than enough of that to last a lifetime. If you're not following my logic here, America is about to remind the other half of the Iron Curtain that your best efforts are a game to us, and if we're not cheating, we're not trying.
Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
The US starts gamer-leaning in their chair and figures out that if they can't go over the missile sites and they can't go through them, then they have to go around them. And they've got two different hacking strats to do this with. One, they bought their movement over the surface of the planet to basically hug the ground and use the Earth's terrain features and curvature to hide from radar detection as long as possible. This works because any object that a radar can't pass through that's solid, such as a mountain or an aircraft, creates a shadow that is devoid of radar energy behind it, called a radar shadow. Flying right off the treetops in this radar shadow would drastically cut down on the window of time that a SAM site had to detect and or fire on the participating aircraft, but flying lower also meant passing through more dense air, which translates to more air resistance. More air resistance means both lower speeds and encountering the vibrations called flutter earlier. Long story short, the plane burns through its structural life faster, and that's how you get things like the top lane B-47 Stratojets and the B-58 Hustlers basically disintegrating in midair for no apparent reason. You can design a plane to main that bottom lane instead, but it has to be reinforced, meaning more meat on the bones and less meat on the bombs. So if Uncle Sam wanted to make a plane that didn't have that laundry list of compromises, they were going to have to go with option 2. Invent magic and make their planes as hard to find with radar in plain sight as possible. Which kind of is magic, because going invisible to radar isn't as easy as it sounds. Radar uses electromagnetic radiation of a certain frequency, like radio waves or microwaves, to find targets by flinging them out over a wide area and translating any waves that bounce back into travel direction and speed of the detected object. And those waves move at the speed of light. You could roll a natural 20 on your design board and make the perfect airplane that always succeeds on its dexterity saving throws. You're still not dodging that. The only real chance anybody's gonna have of hiding in plain sight is to both absorb as much of that energy as possible and then redirect what you can't absorb away from the projecting sensor. People already knew about reflecting radar because you can visualize that the same way you think about a mirror bouncing light. They'd kept that principle in mind when designing the SR-71 and brought its signature down by quite a bit. The conceptual knowledge behind absorbing radar energy also existed at that time, but there was still a missing piece to that stealth puzzle that nobody had figured out yet: diffraction. Diffraction is the tendency of radiation to hit a surface, run down the side of it, and then blast outwards in all directions from the next corner it hits. But nobody had figured out how to calculate that, at least not as far as the US knew. Seemingly unbeknownst to them, back in 1962, Soviet mathematician Pyotr Ufimtsev had published a paper called Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction, which contained exactly the math needed to calculate diffraction. But the Soviets, who had not yet really tried to make a low observable platform of any kind, didn't immediately realize the value of this math and allowed the paper to be published internationally.
This is useless!
The Air Force's Foreign Technology Division translated that paper into English in 1971, and when Lockheed radar expert Dennis Overholser found it in 1975, he realized that the Soviet Union's trash was about to be America's treasure. See, DARPA had already begun the Experimental Survivable Testbed, or XST program, nicknamed Project Harvey, ultimately in search of a single-seat subsonic stealth strike aircraft, try saying that 3 times fast, that would only carry precision-guided air-to-ground weapons. They would start by issuing conceptual design contracts to Lockheed and Northrop that year, and Overholser had probably been looking around for anything that could give Lockheed the edge. And upon finding that math sharp enough to cut through the Soviet defensive lines, he took that paper and dropped it on the desk of Ben Rich, the successor to Kelly Johnson, who approved the creation of a calculator program that could use it. That program, called Echo 1, was done in 3 months. In the 70s. Skunkworks is like Hogwarts, they make magical things happen. However, the programs of the day still weren't powerful enough to compute diffractive properties for things like curved surfaces, so they were still limited to calculating simple shapes. They're literally creating a low-resolution airplane.
Do I look like I know?
This program let Lockheed figure out that the sneakiest shape they could come up with was this rhomboid kite-like shape, which came to be known as the Hopeless Diamond, because it'd be one heck of a pain to make it into an aircraft. But, like I said, Skunkworks is a bunch of wizards, so they cast that spell anyways, and in March of 1976, they submitted their XST design called Have Blue. But there was a problem, and it wasn't the plane. Both competitors were so sneaky that the only thing they could see on the testing radar was the pole they were mounted to. I'm guessing Overholser made a note that the pole was the problem, and the Air Force colonel in charge responded with a snarky retort of, well, if you're so damn clever, build us a new pole.
Don't mind if I do.
Lockheed and Northrop cooperated on the $500,000 project to build a stealth pole, which would do exactly as advertised and basically vanish from the radar. I'm guessing that Lockheed handled the majority of the stealth work because upon seeing the pole dance its way off the radar screen, the Northrop program manager responded by whispering to his team, Jesus, if they can do that with a friggin' pole, what can they do with their damn model? More than them, apparently, because the following month, Lockheed would get a contract to build 2 flying Have Blue demonstrators for $37 million. To make these planes from scratch on such a short timeline, Lockheed flew in as many parts from other planes as they could get their hands on. They would use the engines and heads-up display from an FA-18, the fly-by-wire control system of the F-16, and the main landing gear of the A-10, among other things. The first Have Blue would take flight on December 1st, 1977, but both of them would eventually crash. Turns out the first draft had a couple of big flaws, one of which was caused by the flight computer responding to the angled engine outlets. If the aircraft got hit by a gust of wind to the side or just started moving a bit sideways in flight, known as side slip, it could cause one engine to produce less thrust than the other and force a yaw effect. You would think you could just correct for this with a manual input to the fly-by-wire system, but one of the computers used for measuring control input relied on the plane's movement as a cue instead of air pressure, because they wanted fewer things on the outside for radar to bounce off of. It's a good thought, but in this case, the side slip would cause the computer to add more thrust on the already slipping side side and basically make the plane play the whole spin to lose game right on out of the sky.
It's time for you to go to the forever bugs.
Lockheed fixed that and the fly-by-wire issue that caused the second crash, but they also had to worry about the wing sweep. The wing on this plane, made to be sneaky, was swept back 72.5 degrees to fit the diamond shape. That is farther back than anything but swing wing fighters. This made the Have Blue constantly want to pitch up, and if it went too high, then the pilot had about a snowball's chance in hell of recovering. They would end up making the bottom lip of the exhaust outlet movable to control it, basically creating a rudimentary thrust vectoring system in the 70s. They did eventually lessen the sweep angle to 67.5 degrees, which also increased the wing's area, but the typical benefit of improved wing maneuverability that would have come from that didn't apply. Remember, they couldn't calculate the stealth modifier for a surface that used curves. That includes the wings. So instead of a curved surface, the Have Blue and Nighthawk's wings were made of 3 flat plates on the top and 2 on the bottom, which were so bad at generating liftover drag you'd bleed speed like a fountain. Then they improved the control authority by swapping the inward-leaning tails to outward-leaning ones, made them larger, doubled the wing controls, and then retuned the fly-by-wire system for the whole of it. All that control complexity stemmed from that pitch-up tendency, which made the Nighthawk so unstable in flight that it got the nickname the Wobblin' Goblin for its ability to plow through the sky like a drunk driver. But after those flaws were fixed, it was still good enough to do its job, and so on November 16, 1978, Lockheed received the contract for 5 full-scale development or FSD test planes and 15 production Nighthawks, while the government would stand up a whole new multi-billion-dollar air base with climate-controlled hangars and a completely new unit to fly those Nighthawks. Those hangars were needed to protect the radar-absorbent coatings because rain or excessive humidity could break down the skin and cause it to fall apart, leading to a very expensive repair. The first F-117 would fly out of that base on June 18, 1981, and the aircraft reached its initial operating capability on Halloween of 1983. The spooky season was upon us, and it was now also about to be upon anyone who stepped out of line. It was even almost upon the carrier decks as an alternative to the canceled A-12 stealth bomber, but that didn't work out, and the program's secrecy almost joined the Naval Nighthawk in the trash bin on July 11, 1986. At 1:45 in the morning that day, an F-117 Nighthawk went down on a training mission in Sequoia National Forest, 15 miles northeast of Bakersfield, and set off a 150-acre brush fire. The firefighters show up to handle the fire, and a few minutes later, they find themselves face-to-face with an Air Force security team. Both the area and the airspace around the crash site were immediately declared a national defense area and locked down harder than a prison sentence, while the firefighters themselves were made to sign a secrecy agreement over what they'd seen.
Somebody in here?
Something wrong?
Nope.
Unfortunately, all those firefighters probably have cancer now because the Nighthawk's ram is carcinogenic when it burns. Here in America, we create things so good at doing damage even the wreckage is fatal. The Air Force would replace the broken Nighthawk with a leftover F-101 Voodoo fighter they just happened to have lying around in Area 51, and they would try to cover up the incident by making official statements incredibly vague. In fact, the only clarifying detail that came out was that the aircraft, quote, was not a bomber. However, they couldn't stop the speculations. One journalist claimed they had unnamed sources calling the aircraft the F-19, which, to our knowledge, has never existed. Testor Corporation, a toy company, wasted no time and released a plastic model toy that same month of what they believed to be the F-19. And as one's marketing department does, they insisted it was 80% accurate. However, no F-19 was ever announced, and speculations would run rampant of a covert aircraft project, which were fueled even more after a second crash in October of 1987. The F-19 ended up being in its own video game, it was a big aircraft in Tom Clancy's second ever book as The Frisbee, and it even became the vehicle mode for a Decepticon named Whisper in the first generation Transformers series, all as a side effect of secrecy. This plane was buried under so many layers of classification that it is the only plane in history that we know of that used another top secret program as a cover story. If the Nighthawk was ever found out about, the Air Force planned to pretend that it was part of the Red Eagle squadron made under Project Constant Peg. The Red Eagles were a fighter squadron used to test captured or otherwise acquired Soviet aircraft against American pilots to train for the enemy. I'm going to apply some molasses to that philosophy for a second here, America was willing to both give the Soviets the propaganda value of claiming they had a plane they didn't actually have, and reveal that they knew every single Soviet fighter of the time besides the MiG-29 and Su-27 inside and out, before they were willing to acknowledge they had a stealth strike plane. And I think the answer to why so secret probably lies in the name. As you might have noticed, the Nighthawk is made specifically for precision ground attack, not fighting planes. Now, the reason for that, put out by General Robert J. Dixon, an officer at the time at Tactical Air Command, was that the F-117 wasn't called a fighter to fool the enemy, it was to fool noob pilots into wanting to fly it. Basically stating the logic that pilots would be a lot less enthused to fly a bomber than a fighter. However, and I'm gonna put my tinfoil hat on here for a second, that doesn't make any sense. When you get selected as a pilot for the Air Force, or for any US branch for that matter, they tell you what plane you're gonna fly. You don't get to pick, so tricking the pilots really isn't necessary. So what other reason could they have had for the naming convention? Well, on June 17, 1979, the SALT II Treaty was signed in Vienna by the United States and the Soviet Union, with SALT standing for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This was a nuclear weapons limitation treaty restricting the number of delivery vehicles to 2,250, with those vehicles classified as intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, and, more importantly here, heavy bombers. This treaty wouldn't expire until December 31st, 1985, which encompasses a solid chunk of the F-117's development and early service timeline. And when the crashes occurred after the expiration of the SALT II Treaty, the Reagan administration was then in the process of trying to negotiate the improved START nuclear disarmament treaty.
That makes way too much sense.
So my best guess as to why the F-117 was given a fighter designation was not to trick the pilots, but to avoid scaring the Soviets. By implying to any intelligence leaks that it was not a medium or tactical bomber, the US would prevent the Soviets from even having the option to speculate that America was working on a new bomber that might skirt the rules on their own treaties. If that rumor had gotten off the ground, America would appear to be just creating rules for the purpose of gaining an advantage, and it'd probably cause all of the nuclear limitation talks going on to break down. In response, the Soviets would probably panic develop their own stealth bomber and try to continue the arms race for another several decades. This would also explain why when the F-117 crashed in 1986, the only detail given out by the government was that the aircraft was not a bomber. And if I had to guess, the Century Series 3-digit designation was probably a double tap on that intent. By giving the plane a designation that only should have existed before the Tri-Service Designation System came out in 1962, any attempt to date the program's start would first lead to the belief that this whole thing started well before the nuclear treaties came into play, and thus become the backup plan to prevent that speculation of attempts to circumvent them. And at the very least, even if all that fell through, the Soviet intelligence would still have an aneurysm wondering where the other 5 fighters were making up 112 through 116. This entire naming convention feels like the US was just playing 5D chess with the Soviets.
What part of that was out of character for me?
But regardless of what the reason was for the name, the F-117 would play Schrodinger's cat with the entire planet until November of 1988, when the existence of the flying Cybertruck was finally acknowledged, albeit via a grainly, deliberately distorted picture of it. The first true stealth aircraft would receive the Collier Trophy in 1989, the highest award for aerospace engineering achievement and development, and before the public even got a good look at it, the plane was sent into a combat operation for the first time on December 19, 1989 as part of Operation Just Cause over Panama. Short version of that was a former paid CIA informant named Manuel Noriega had gotten involved in the drug trade and overthrown the Panamanian government. He then convinced his new assembly to declare war on the United States, a couple days after which Panamanian soldiers ambushed and killed an unarmed, out-of-uniform U.S. Marine. So yeah, I'm pretty sure this guy is the all-time record holder for pissing off Uncle Sam besides the Imperial Japanese. And the day before they launched the ground invasion, F-117s would drop a pair of bombs on a field outside of an army barracks. No explosives, no big flash, just a pair of bomb-looking things outside to scare the shit out of the forces there and let them know what their big little man had gotten themselves into.
Ha! You missed! Or did I?
The F-117s were apparently the only aircraft on the continental United States at the time capable of dropping laser-guided bombs, hence why they were sent in for this particular show of force. However, the press reports spread the story that it was a missed attack, and credit was originally given to the F-111, which only worked out because EF-111 Raven electronic warfare planes were sent in to provide jamming support. As for the conflict itself, the bulk of the fighting would start on December 20th and be over in about 5 days. Noriega would evade capture for 4 more days days until the US forces found him hiding in the embassy building, where they convinced him to surrender on January 3rd, 1990 after giving him a backstage pass to the loudest rock concert in history, aka blasting the embassy building with rock songs dialed well up past safe levels for several hours. I bet the E4 Mafia got to pick the playlist for the day because they hit him with songs like I Fought the Law by The Clash, Panama by Van Halen, All I Want Is You by U2, and If I Had a Rocket Launcher by Bruce Cockburn. The F-117 would come back into the picture later that year in April when it was finally shown to the public via an air show at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. And here's the funny thing, right? Lockheed and the Air Force thought they were only going to be able to keep the plane secret for 1 or 2 years. They made it for over a decade. The cockroach laid low for so long it even outdid bureaucratic expectations. Like at that point, they were just pushing it out as far as they could just to see how long they could make it last. By that July, the last of the 59 Nighthawks ever built were delivered, the majority of which were sent over to Saudi Arabia a few months later. The F-117s would stand guard over Saudi skies to deter Saddam Hussein from going any farther than Kuwait as part of Operation Desert Shield before getting serious in Desert Storm, which had to have been the worst time possible to invade somebody. Can you imagine waltzing onto the world stage and announcing that you've invaded a country literally a few months after the world police, aka America, finally stops hiding the fact that they've had a magic airplane on standby for over 10 years? Somebody picked the wrong time to start a fight, and now people were about to find out what this flying piece of charcoal could do to somebody. The main feature of the F-117 was its 2 internal bomb bays that could carry 1 weapon each, totaling up to 5,000 pounds of bedtime wishes between the 2 of them. Add up to 2,812 gallons or 18,840 pounds of internal fuel, and the empty weight of 29,500 pounds or 13,400 kilos would jump up to a maximum of 52,500 pounds or 23,800 knot pounds. 2 General Electric F404 engines that were pulled from the FA-18 Legacy Hornets sans the afterburners could put out up to 10,600 pounds of thrust and push the sneaky mountain Bumblebee to a max cruising speed of 684 miles an hour. Without refueling, it can fly for over 1,000 miles or over 1,700 knot miles. But with refueling, it can go anywhere it wants. In fact, despite not being a fighter, it holds the longest non-stop fighter flight record by flying from Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico to Kuwait with aerial refueling in 18.5 hours.
Are we there yet?
We get there when we get there.
But what made it special was the one thing it was designed to do, and that was play Now You See Me, No You Don't with enemy air defenses. Aside from being made from a geometry class, it also had a coating of radar-absorbent materials, or RAM, to absorb energy on top of redirecting it, including along the inside of the inlets to catch any energy that got past the bird cage on the front. The inlets were covered by a wire mesh with spacing small enough to block the high-frequency radar waves of a fire control radar. And if those inlets iced up in flight, they would basically use windshield wipers with de-icing fluid to clear the grates. This did mess with the air going through them though, so to make sure the engines had enough air on takeoff, secondary intakes would open up on top of the ducts and close as the plane sped up. The rectangular engine outlets also had a platypus tail, or a setup that allowed the exhaust gases to spread out and cool faster to reduce the heat signature, which also doubled as that nose-down control surface it needed if it pitched up too far. And the US sent 36 of these into Desert Storm after Desert Shield expanded into the Conquest tech tree. They may have only made up less than 3% of all coalition air forces, but they swung with the best of them at 30% of coalition targets.
Fortunately, I am mighty.
They would attack air defense systems right from the get-go in the air war, and in concert with the other aircraft of the fleet, the US would pummel Iraq's air defenses over the course of the first 5 days. And I say 5 days because while a lot of stories say the aircraft was instrumental, it wasn't as perfect as it was made out to be. On day 1, 30 F-117s attacked 37 targets. However, only 21 of those targets were reported hit, and of those 21, 40% of the strikes missed. As for the targets that were hit, 11 had battle damage assessments run on them, of which only 2 could be confirmed completely dead. To add to that, it may be claimed that the Nighthawk had an 80% success rate on its over 1,200 sorties, but after-action analysis by the Government Accountability Office several years later was only able to verify an effectiveness rate of between 41 and 60%, and it was outranked in per-weapon accuracy by the F-111F Aardvark. That said, of all the platforms involved, the F-117 was rated as having the highest success success total of the conflict and the third highest success rate against verifiable targets. And it was the preferred aircraft for deleting static high-value targets, command, control, and communication facilities, leadership outposts, and nuclear, biological, and chemical targets. It also suffered 0 damage and 0 losses whatsoever, although given the altitudes it flew at, the fact that it flew at night, and the shoot-down rates for the conflict, it was just as statistically possible that even non-stealthy platforms would have received similar damage and loss numbers for the number of missions the Nighthawks flew. In particular, the F-111F and F-16 had no nighttime losses, and the A-10 had neither losses nor damage at night, and all of them flew more night missions than the Nighthawks did.
I don't know what they're so happy about.
But actual combat revealed actual problems. Poor weather would prevent the laser designators from drawing a bead on the target all the time, and some pilots would come back with their laser-guided weapons. So in January 2004, they would get the ability to carry JDAMs, which would make an enemy apologize to their grid coordinate instead of you. They could also only open one bomb bay at a time, which forced pilots to make multiple passes on some targets. That got fixed, and then integrated stealthy antennas were added so pilots could coordinate during attack runs, which they couldn't do previously because the original antennas had to be retracted for full stealth. But not every takeaway was bad news, because the big one the Air Force got from the F-117 and Desert Storm was that it was cheaper to maintain a fleet of stealth fighters for taking out air defenses than a much larger fleet of several different assets, because a stealth aircraft had enough protection to not always require things like fighter escort. While it is possible this was a biased decision based on how quickly they took out Iraq's air defenses, this conclusion at least appears to reduce the overall maintenance cost of a fleet tailored to winning over contested airspace by several $billion. And that is probably one of the biggest reasons why stealth became the primary push of the last 2 decades. But, as demonstrated 8 years later, it still isn't a match for a guy with a golden gun. Arguably the most hotly debated item in the Nighthawk's history is the one time it got shot down over Serbia during Operation Allied Force. An F-117 piloted by Colonel Dale Zelko was shot down on March 27, 1999 by an S-125 Neva SAM battery commanded by Yugoslavian commander Zoltov Dani. Dani was a fairly clever enemy who had learned from studying the Lebanon War in 1982 that mobility was the key to a SAM site's survival, and to that end he had trained the ever-living hell out of his crew. His teams were skilled enough to break down these static missile batteries and put them on a truck to move in as little as an hour and a half, and had figured out that you could work around the threat of harm anti-radiation missiles by using your radar for no longer than 40 seconds and use makeshift MiG-21 radars on the perimeter as decoys. Long story short, he was a smart guy who understood that skill mattered. Now, the prevailing story of what happened was that the Air Force got complacent and allowed their flight paths to be routine, combined with the Yugoslavians having spies around NATO bases, so Donnie knew the Nighthawk was coming. There were also no escorts that day due to bad weather, so the F-117 was flying without harm or jamming support. So when the Nighthawk came sauntering on over the missile site and opened its bomb bay doors, the SAM site locked it, fired 2 missiles, and shot it down. However, there are a few holes in that story. The few seconds that a bomb bay would be open for wouldn't be enough to keep a lock from launch to target, which would imply that the missiles would have had to have gotten close enough that the stealth profile couldn't reduce the radar signature enough to break the lock anymore. However, that theory relies on either the Nighthawk being so close that it was practically right on top of the missile battery, or the missile being way faster than an S-125 should be capable of. Because without either of those parts, the missile should have pretty much stopped tracking the second the bomb bay doors closed. Additionally, even if they had people watching the air bases and knew what took off, there's no way they would have known where they were headed unless they had a spy inside the command structure giving mission orders, which in most cases is not specified and would have been a way bigger issue. There is at least one source that says this did occur, but that was an Air Force aerospace engineer on frickin' Quora. So, you know, somebody who probably wasn't there and is yakking away on a source platform that's about as reliable by itself as a raccoon raiding a restaurant. Am I calling myself out a little bit here? Don't worry about it, that's why I'm giving you both sides. And to cap it off, it's not very likely that the Nighthawk was following a consistent, complacent flight path because Allied Force started on March 24th, only 3 days before the shootdown happened. With all the targets that coalition forces would have needed to hit, it's not very likely they would have made so many runs on this one target area that they had established a consistent attack run pattern to it. And that brings me to an alternate story I was presented with via a video I will leave in the description. This story has its own points of contention, such as listing some Russian sources in its description likely to describe their own system capabilities, so I would heavily recommend that people do their own research more so than usual, and I invite any subject matter experts who fully understand radars and such to comment here. I could use HLC's help on this one.
Where is Arthur when I need him?
But the story claims that luck was involved in multiple components of the engagement. For one thing, it's claimed the SAM battery didn't have intelligence in advance, and upon declaration of war, the batteries were ordered to be moved from their peacetime locations to the areas of older bases, meaning that Donnie himself could not have intentionally placed his battery directly in the F-117's flight path without going too far from his designated station. Although if the flight path went over his station anyways, that wouldn't have mattered. Another item of luck is that in their possession, they had the more advanced P-18 search radar trucks rather than the P-15s available to most of the other air defense units. This would make sense considering that Danny has the background of a more skilled air defender, and so he would likely have been able to push for better equipment for his unit. However, this search radar is claimed to be able to use lower frequencies in its detection, which in this case are said to be able to detect the F-117 from a side-on position, even with its bomb bays closed. Whether or not it can tune its frequencies low enough to detect stealth platforms is something I would probably have to see to believe, but I can't say for certain that it's impossible. They also noted the lack of radars going blind while they were picking up the signal, indicating a lack of electronic jamming support that was typically present and thus enabling them to actually see anything at all on radar in the first place. That said, the radar signature was still small, and more importantly, they couldn't see it at all on the fire control radar, which is to be expected. So they switched the missile over to manual tracking.
Targeting system's knackered, boss.
I'm eyeballing it.
Stop. These guys are gonna eyeball a supersonic missile shot on a moving jet target at night using nothing but their radar dashboard, if that's what's happening. Although, to be fair, with how often America's proven that reality is stranger than fiction, I wouldn't be surprised if that flavor of badass happened to queue up on the enemy team for once.
Finally, a worthy opponent. Our battle will be legendary!
It's insane, but not impossible. The missile crew also reportedly chose a 3-point guidance system for the missile, which basically aligns the missile's flight path to the guidance radar's line of sight. Normally, this is done to ignore jamming, but in this case, they're eyeballing a missile shot via line of sight tracking. And if that target moves, this maneuver gets way more complicated, which the F-117 could do if it detected the search radar looking at it. From what I can find, the F-117 didn't have a radar warning receiver, but it is speculated to have had a radar location system, which was mounted in a pair of systems under the wing roots that would fold out. However, this RLS would drastically increase the Nighthawk's radar signature, and as such, they would have rarely used it even for the suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses or seed and deed missions they were meant for. By 2006, the RLS was listed as unsupported, but there's very little evidence to suggest they existed at all. So whether or not the Nighthawk has radar warning is pretty much left up to
imagination.
And the last piece of luck was the fact that the F-117 was claimed to be right in the perfect attack window for the SAM site in use. If it had been a few kilometers or a few degrees off course, it's claimed that radar dashboard would have been a whole lot of, oh hey, look at that. This entire story relies so heavily on luck. But if it is true, then the resulting propaganda storm laid out by Serbia really speaks to how sad some of the attempts are to prove that American tech isn't all that in a bag of chips. Because they're sitting there screaming that American stealth doesn't mean jack when the only reason they knocked the bird out was because they had a borderline superhuman crew on their team who could pull off a War Thunder trick shot at night in real life.
It's like saying reading is fun when I'm downing a handle of Jack Daniels. Like, is the reading part the fun part? Are you sure that's where the fun is coming from?
And if that story isn't true, then they still just got a lucky shot. Big whoop. The Serbians did apparently hit another one sometime later without killing it, but details on that are still fresh and still sparse, so the jury's kind of out on that one. Still calling it a lucky shot, though. According to the second theory's account, the second missile malfunctioned and the radar lost track, but the first one impacted 31 seconds after launch. Additionally, Donnie claimed not to have known he was shooting at an F-117 until after the wreckage was found and identified. Zelko, however, reported seeing two missiles, with the first one detonating close enough to rock the aircraft and the second causing complete loss of control. What might have happened there was that the first missile missed and detonated near the target, registering on the radar dashboard as a hit.
I was just feeling around for my surroundings. Space was my surroundings.
They probably thought the second missile malfunctioned because they lost track of it on their end, which might not have necessarily correlated to the missile itself being lost. Regardless, Zelko ejected safely and was rescued by NATO forces. And at this point, the only agreed upon details between these two accounts are that the F-117 had no electronic jamming support and there was no perceived threat of harm missiles to the battery. Otherwise, it's a lot of hypotheticals, theoreticals, and what the fuckadals because I have to choose between trusting either Russian documents or a Quora post. I have no idea which one's worse, and now I need a drink. Russia and China likely got their hands on the wreckage via this crash and used it for their own ends. Although by that point, we had the B-2 and the F-22 entering service, so it's not like they were getting their hands on anything new. Meanwhile, the F-117 would go on, and while it would start helping out Operation Iraqi Freedom, it wouldn't see the end of it. It was getting old, and its stealth and maneuverability were no longer up to frontline par. So by December of 2006, the first 10 of the 55 remaining F-117 Nighthawks were retired, and the rest had finished following suit by April 22, 2008, with 2 of them being given a celebratory Stars and Stripes paint job just for the occasion. And that is not the end of the story.
I thought you were dead.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
Yeah, no, the Nighthawk's still kicking. 45 of them are kept in flyable storage and occasionally brought out as aggressor aircraft for training, to simulate 5th-generation adversary aircraft and low-observable cruise missiles, as well as to test out the occasional chrome-dip paint job, apparently. It's also possible that a few Nighthawks briefly returned to combat over Syria in 2017, but this is unconfirmed as of yet. But what has been confirmed is that the Nighthawks aren't going anywhere, because maintenance and parts for the 45 remaining Nighthawks have been secured for as far out as 2034. The other 10 are currently living in various museums, although they're not 100% complete because parts of it are still classified to this day. Any F-117s on display will either have their wings' leading edges covered with a box or just straight up removed, and any radar-absorbent coatings will also have to be taken off. These Hawks may be allowed to rest in peace, but the others still lie in wait, and their time hasn't come yet. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you liked what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.